Okay, so we want to find the lowest such price, the highest such price for a revenue function, um, and given the price per product. Okay, so without diving into, without trying to make sense of all of it, we just kind of focus on the parts and then maybe later talk about the overall piece. So we have a price function that's a function of x, input x, output p. And we have a revenue function that multiplies x times p. So basically it's just one quick step to get the revenue function as a function of x. I'll use that notation, x times p, and then I'll run the x through. Okay, so this is your revenue function. This is kind of a typical word problem, and then the question will be, well, what price P would yield a revenue 8,300? Okay, so since we have this function that depends on x, we can find how many units we sell, and based on how many units we sell, that will determine prices P that would yield a revenue of 8,300. So let me try to explain that again. So they're saying that if the revenue is 8,300, then if I solve this equation, basically they're giving us the output for our revenue function. If I can solve this equation, then I will have a value for x that gives me how many units will give us a revenue of 8,300. And then we'll have to go back to price by plugging this back in. Okay, so it's a little tricky. It'd be a lot easier if they said, determine how many units to sell X that would yield a revenue of 8,300. So I said my revenue function 8,300, solve for X, I'd be done. Okay, and there's two answers for that. And the idea would be, because this is a quadratic function, there would be two different places. If I tried to graph the revenue function, this will be a inaccurate graph, but the idea is 8,300 is like, let's say this horizontal line is 8,300. So it's going to be two different places, two different x values that will give me a revenue of 8,300. That is, if x is the number of units, if I produce this many units, I will make 8,300 in revenue. But I can also produce less units and make 8,300 in revenue. And of course, we'd have to consider the price, right? Basically, we're going to charge a lot of money and not sell many and make that revenue, or we'll charge a little bit of money and sell a bunch. That would be the idea. Okay, so like I said, this would be much easier or just a little less tricky if it just said determine the X value that would give us a revenue of 8,300. But it doesn't, it just says determine the P value. So first, since we built this function of X right here, we're going to first solve for X and then ... and we'll solve for P because we know the connection there. Okay, so how am I going to solve this equation? I would set this to 0. I'm going to add 0.025 x squared. 0.025 x squared comes to the right. And then I would subtract 108x minus 108x. And if I add that and I subtract that, I end up with a 0 on the right side. And this guy is positive. He stays there all by himself. Okay, so now I have a quadratic equation. And that is not a nice quadratic equation. It's kind of up to you if you want to deal with the 0.025. You could multiply everything by 1,000 and you'd have a 25 as your A term. You could divide everything by 0.025 and then you would have a 1 as an A term, or you could just let A be 0.025 and use your quadratic formula. So I'll skip that part. You should get, what did I get? Well, maybe I can't skip it. Is it still on my calculator? Yeah, if you have questions about that, let me know. I got, let's see, for X, it was 4240 and 78.2. 78.2 and 4240. Okay, and that's when I did X equals negative B doing that. Negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared, that's a 108, minus 4 times a times c all over 2 times a. Dot, dot, dot. So it's a lot of calculator work. So once you can get some practice with that, hopefully you get that. If you have a question about how I got from this quadratic formula, negative b plus minus square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a, to these answers, just send me a message. I can kind of explain that better. But that gives me the two values for x for which I'm going to make this revenue of 8,300. But that's not the question, right? We want the price. So then I'm going to have two different prices that should yield this revenue, right? So this value of 78.2 gives me a revenue of 8,300. So if I want to know what the price would be set at, I would have to plug in that to my price formula right here. So 108 minus 0.025 times 78.2. And this one's going to go 108 minus 0.025 times 4240. And that'll give me two different prices. And that's why I know this, sometimes the computer is a little confusing. Lowest such price. It just wants the lower of the two prices. So let's see what we get. My calculator's acting a little bit funny. Okay, 108 minus 0.025 times 78.2 in my calculator gives me $106. 106.05. So if I set it at that price, I'll make revenue 8,300. And the other one's going to be 108 minus 0.025 times 4240, and I get $2. Okay, and that's the idea. If you want a revenue of 8,300, and for this particular problem, you either charge $2 and you would most likely sell a whole bunch of them, or you charge $106 and you would sell less of them. Okay, so I hope that makes sense. Just be careful what they're asking for. So the lowest price then would be 2, and the higher would be around 106. So just always with word problems, be careful what they're asking for. The idea with this one is they give you basically a function of x. You have to do a little bit of work to get here. You got a function of x. But the question they're asking about is what your value for p is. So you have to go back to your function for p. So I hope that makes sense. But if you still have questions, let me know.